Hi everyone, my name is Emily Umbers and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here today on behalf of the Australian International Development Network, or AIDEN as we call ourselves. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners whose land I'm dialing in from today, the Yorta people. I recognise their connection to land and waterways and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. AIDEN advocates for more and better international giving and investing from Australians. Our aim is to raise the case for global giving with a particular focus on private capital mobilisation and impact investing to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Today's session will be hosted by Kerren Morris, Executive Director of the Emergency Action Alliance. We're thrilled to be working with Kerren and EAA and their member organisations for this really important conversation on the Horn of Africa. Both the chat functions and the Q&A are open. We encourage you to use them and to interact with the panel. And I'll hand it over to you now, Kerren.
Great, thank you, Emily and Aidan, for this opportunity to brief everyone today on the hunger crisis in the Horn of Africa, how our members are already providing life-saving assistance and what more help is needed. I'm joined today by a panel of experts and leaders in humanitarian disaster response, including people on the ground who can give a first-hand perspective on what is happening in the Horn of Africa. So today we'll hear from Sophie Gebreyes, country representative of Lutheran World Federation in Ethiopia, and Sophie is joining us from Addis Ababa. Susan Otieno, Executive Director of ActionAid International in Kenya, and Susan is joining us from Nairobi. Paul Healy is Country Director in Somalia for Trócaire, which is Caritas Australia's partner on the ground in Somalia. So Paul is also joining us from Nairobi today, although his office is based in Mogadishu. And we have Trudi Mitchell, CEO of Australia for UNHCR, joining us from Sydney. So the sheer scale of this crisis in the Horn of Africa is quite hard to comprehend. Now enduring the fifth failed rainy season, crops have failed, livestock have died, and this is leaving farming communities with no means of survival. And their only hope is trekking long distances through the heat and dust to overcrowded refugee camps. The crisis is the worst it's been for decades, and yet it receives very little news coverage. So there's pretty low public awareness of the severity of this catastrophe. Sadly, this means that the emergency does not receive a high level of funding for the critical resources needed to save more lives. In September last year, the Australian government announced a $15 million support package for the crisis, including a $5 million contribution to the Emergency Action Alliance appeal. Recognising that by standing together, the 15 members of the Emergency Action Alliance can have greater impact and raise more funds by working together, saving more lives. There have since been other package announcements that have come through, and we really appreciate the Australian government's support for this emergency. So all 15 of Emergency Action Alliance members, each leading aid organisations in disaster response, were already responding to the emergency, and each one received a proportion of the funds raised. Since then, those funds have helped provide assistance to over 190,000 people in the region, including food, water, shelter and medical assistance. And yet this barely scratches the surface of what is needed. So I'll turn to the panel now and have a conversation about what's really happening on the ground. And I'll start first, if it's okay, with Sophia. If I can start with you in the situation in Ethiopia, can you tell us more about the crisis? What's being done by Lutheran World Service to help, and what help is needed right now?
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening, good morning, everyone. Thank you for organizing this webinar and for giving us the opportunity to address, colleagues and partners in Australia. I'm very thankful for the support that we have received thus far from, NGOs and partners, but also the Australian government. Thank you. Ethiopia, of course, we're facing several years now, multiple crises, and they're intersecting. So it's not just about the drought, which the drought itself is very severe. And this is the fifth consecutive, failed rains in the country, particularly in the pastoralist and agro-pastoralist areas of the country, which are large swath of land. And then we have the explosion of intercommunal conflicts in the country since 2017. And then, of course, the northern Ethiopia conflict, or the Trócaire conflict, and the spillover into Amhara and Afar, with the 2-year de facto blockade on Trócaire imposed by the federal government. And then we have massive displacement, since 2017 to now. We've never seen that before. I mean, this is a new phenomena. But Ethiopia has received, an enviable accolade of topping the highest number of displacement in 2018 and 19 in the world, before the Ukraine crisis, obviously. And then you have the flooding and disease outbreaks, Ukraine war, the rampant inflation in the country. And now the food, as if this is not enough, we have the food diversion scandal and the food aid suspension in the country for the past few months, which has exacerbated the food insecurity situation in the country. Currently, we have 28.6 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, 24 million people currently living in drought-affected areas, about 6.8 million livestock deaths because of the drought since 2021, and 20 million people estimated to be experiencing food insecurity. We have 3.5 million people internally displaced, which is down from 5 million since 2021, but still very high, and 31.9 people affected by drought. The food basket costs 40% more than a year ago, and then food prices have quadrupled. So millions of Ethiopians and close to 1 million refugees in the country, because we have also refugee influxes in the country amidst the effect of prolonged conflict, drought, displacement, and disease outbreaks. But we have a highly underfunded humanitarian response plan, which is only a response plan funded at only 24%. So really, this is a great opportunity to let the Australian people know about the needs in the country, massive needs that we have. Like I said, this has been exacerbated by various factors like the Ukraine crisis, high prices for food and input. And now, currently, actually, we're seeing the March and the May Genna season has been favorable in terms of rain, but in some places, of course, that has provoked, heavy flooding. But it's not enough. And of course, it's resulted in improved water and pasture availability, but households, have few options to benefit from increased food and income due to the extreme erosion of pastoral livelihoods during the drought, the consecutive, 5, failed rains. And so they don't have the coping mechanism to be able to benefit from that. We're seeing some improvement in livestock conditions because of the March-May rains, but livestock conceptions are currently very low. Further, due to the gestation period of livestock, milk availability will not increase until the next birthing season in the late 2023. So while there have been minor improvement in livestock, food prices remain high, driving poor purchasing power among those who still have and are willing to sell their livestock. This is mostly in the pastoralist areas in Somali region, also in Oromia region, but in Trócaire, the situation is it's dire because they have been under the de facto blockade, because they're really the conflict that lasted from November 2020 to November 2022. And so there, the situation is really extremely concerning. The nutritional status of children is, terrifying. And so, there hasn't been a lot of support for the Trócaire government. They're just receiving federal transfers into the government because of the de facto blockade. And so we are seeing a lot of IPC3 and IPC4 in these areas, in Trócaire, in Oromia and Somali region for the emergency classification. So yeah, outcomes are expected to persist at least till September, October, when people maybe will be able to harvest, taking advantage of the recent rains. But till then, we're really in the heart of the lean season. So this is now where people should be assisted with food assistance. With 1 million refugees and 20-something people who need assistance, nothing is moving now. And so some of us who are not very big food actors are trying to redirect our resources from WASH, from other life-saving activities, to tide these communities over with some cash assistance and stuff like that, so that, you know, we can tide them over until the harvest season. We're hoping that the harvest season will be relatively good because of the good rains this year. But from now to October, it's a lot of months to be without food assistance. So what is LWF doing? What we're doing is, you know, continuing to support the communities, redirecting some resources that we have to support with food, as well with cash. But of course, we're reaching tiny number of people because we don't have the capacity that the USAID and WFP had. And so we're, you know, reaching maybe 11, 15,000 people in Amhara, in Somali, Oromia, and Tigray put together. So there's a huge need of, I think, really cash injection. If food assistance is not going to be allowed in the country because of the scandal, maybe we can really try to do food cash so that people can buy food, and also support with input. This is very, very important that the people now take advantage of the rainy season with tools, with fertilizers, with seeds, so that by you know, the rainy season, they can plant and have something to eat in October, whether or not the food assistance will resume. Of course, there are rumors that they are, you know, finishing the investigation and that food aid will resume in July, but we're not sure. We're not sure, so we're continuing with our advocacy, with our partners, with donors. Do not punish the people who have nothing to do. I mean, these people, you know, they suffered during the blockade and the drought, and then the diversion, when we all thought that they were receiving the food. So, you know, they didn't receive food during the diversion, and now during the suspension. So it's really, I mean, people they don't have any more coping mechanism left. So I really appreciate this panel. My message is, we really have to support people. Food assistance, you know, it's very difficult. It requires a lot of logistics. Right now that has stopped, but we can support the people with cash. And so my plea would be to really pray for the people, for Ethiopia, and to support with cash. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Over.
Great. Thanks, Sophia, for that. I really appreciate you painting a picture for us of the reality on the ground there in Ethiopia. And I'm thinking of the people caught in the middle of a convergence of multiple factors that are completely outside of their control. And now this new situation that's emerging and hopefully will be resolved really quickly. So thank you for that. And yeah, I second your request for support, because clearly this is really a catastrophic situation for the people there in Ethiopia. Susan, if I can turn to you now, you're working with ActionAid in Kenya. I hope that you might be able to help us understand what's happening there, the scale of the emergency in Kenya, what ActionAid is doing to help, and the specific focus areas that you have and what you're doing at the moment. So over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for this opportunity. Thanks to the support that we've continued to receive. Do let me know if you can hear me well. The Kenyan context is similar to the Ethiopian context because it cuts across the Horn of Africa. And so the northeastern part in particular is the part of the most affected, but the effects of the drought is felt now in all the was felt in the 24 counties. We've seen some of the rains coming, but it's not sufficient, as my colleague from Ethiopia has mentioned. What happened is that we had some flash floods, and up to a point where farmers, the pastoralists, even lost some of the stock that they had left out of the flooding. And of course, then these can just again show us the kind of weather patterns that we are now experiencing: unstable, severe, punitive, if I can say. Again, the Kenyan context as well, we were emerging from COVID, and we went into the energy and food crisis due to the Ukrainian war. Then the droughts equally came in, and even as a country, we are battling with the debt crisis, and all these coupled together, despite the desire to help and fully support the communities that are affected. There are certain elements that still pose as a challenge. When there's energy and food prices crisis, then it means the food prices are soaring to some extent, like cooking oil, which is almost 3 times what it was before. The maize flour is equally 3 times the cost that it was before. So you can imagine families that are receiving cash transfers, and the amount of food that they can eventually secure. This becomes the bigger challenge. We've seen now women reducing on the portion of food that they have to eat, because culturally women would serve themselves last. And so what majority of the women are doing is to reduce on the portion. In certain communities, you've had women tie their stomachs so that then they can withstand the hunger pangs for their children to eat. And that means as you tie your stomach, you can even miss a meal in a day and get the next meal, possibly. We've seen children in school collapsing due to hunger, while the government is equally trying to do food distribution, but it's not sufficient. And for us, the benefit that we have is that the areas where we work are the extreme distances within the counties that we work in. We've been able to distribute food, and the days that there's food in school, you will see children in school. As you move around the communities, you meet children who are not in school. And when you ask them, why are you not in school? The first thing they tell you is that food was not being distributed in school. So we've seen at least an advantage that when there's food in school, we are also retaining children in schools. Again, going back to the women, majority of the communities are pastoralist communities that practiced rites of passage that leads girls into marriage at the age of 14. And this ideally has been the case, that we've seen more girls dropping out of school, getting married, because in a family, the aim is to offload the number of, for lack of a better word, the number of mouths that you're feeding. So then you would easily allow your daughter to get married to an old man, a 13, 14-year-old would get married to a 55, 60-year-old man who probably has some animals to give back as dowry to the family, because their dignity is looked at from the number of cattle, the number of camels, goats that you have. And if you've lost everything in drought, it's a way of restocking. So girls, again, are facing that challenge. Of course, domestic violence has increased, because what happens is that the men and women walk long distances in search of water and food and pasture for the animals. So our father would leave, husband would leave, and when he comes back with nothing, the first question, of course, because the woman was back at home, they are the ones who are bearing the care work, taking care of the sick who they may have remained with, the children, and probably the goats that they may have remained with. You find that at that point, when she asks for, let's say, food, what have you brought home? Majority of the women are reporting increased domestic violence. And so instead of going ahead to ask, they're looking for means of getting that food. In one of the areas where water is at a long distance, far from the homes, around where they would go like 20 to 30 kilometers to get water, the benefit of having the motorbikes has helped, but again, it has brought in what they're experiencing as sex for water. You want to buy water, it's being distributed in low quantities. And again, the motorbike rider who's distributing then says, you have to pay me beyond the money that you're giving me. And that's what they're calling sex for water. So that has been the situation, especially for the women in the context. We cannot underscore malnutrition. They rely on the goats, they rely on the milk, and that again is not sufficient. As my colleague from Ethiopia has said, it will take a period for the gestation and the families to get milk. And so in Kenya, we are seeing over 250 children who are actually threatened by malnutrition. Remember that when we supply, or when there's food that is accessible, it's probably maize, and all that they can have could be porridge. In what measure, that's again something to be determined. The aspect of drinking water or even accessing potable water has also led to women reporting cases of UTI, because as I said, women do sacrifice in their families because they are the caregivers. And so if water is not sufficient, cleaning myself will not be the first priority. I'll look at if can my children drink water? Can they even wash their faces? Can we cook food? Then I will wait. And in such cases, we can't clean the toilets well, then it means risks of UTI amongst them. In terms of the support, ActionAid adopts a women-led approach, because as I've listed out, you see that some of the hidden effects would ideally be found in the women and girls, not saying that the men are not affected. But for this case, then, we try to build women-led mechanisms whereby they take leadership in identifying the crisis, in identifying the effects, in proposing the solutions, in leading some of the village committees. The school feeding, we've done a lot of supplementing to what the government could give, which is equally not enough. There's been some distribution, as I said, in the schools nearby where we work, in five counties. We are also doing a lot of cash transfer, knowing how the market has been distorted. The transport system is distorted. If energy is expensive, it means if food has to be transported, then that's going to be very expensive. If we have to track water, then it's expensive. So what we're doing is a lot of cash transfer first to retain their dignity. It's within you to decide how you're going to spend, what you're going to buy to feed the family, but also using to maintain the local market, because that's also critical. If we keep importing into the communities, then it affects the local markets. We've activated a lot of the protection mechanism, because with long distances, girls have reported abuse, women have reported abuse. So we have protection mechanisms whereby the local institutions led by the local women networks and institutions are connecting with families to try and help safeguard and protect the children, protect the girls, who some of them are not even in school. We've rescued girls from early marriages, from child marriages, not early marriages. Many a times I don't like calling it child marriage because it means like we are rubber stamping. But that's what we can call it for now. We've rescued girls from child marriages. Because the family had married them off, they cannot go back to school there, so they need to be in a protection center as the matter is being looked into and being addressed. We've worked closely also to, at advocacy level, at government level, is to advocate for domestic allocation, continuous domestic allocation, the little that we are collecting as a country. How are we allocating it to be able to support, especially the county governments, the allocation that they receive? We've worked also with the communities to be able to ask them to be accountable because that then motivates a lot of support. Lastly, there's a lot that is still needed. Schools are still running, and that is the first point of reaching out to the women, the students, the children in school, the women who had started voluntary savings and lending mechanism are now moving that into food. So instead of saving money, which they cannot get, the little that they get, if we inject some capital in there, they are able to buy food and distribute amongst themselves and continue with it. Some have started trading with the little that they receive, and that would be a mechanism for survival, because we're looking at how can they build some resilience with the little that they have. We have rehabilitated some water points, but more need to be rehabilitated. The water pans, of course, they have to be cleaned, clear out the sealage, so that then it's able to accommodate more water. And of course, those who can do alternatives like farming, we are running an agroecology project whereby we are encouraging to first produce for your family, the little that you can. But as I said, access to water remains a big challenge. And that's one thing that we are looking into. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you to those who've supported us this far. And we know we can still do more. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Susan. And I hope that both you and Sophia and all of our panelists can stay with us. So there's going to be some questions, I know, from the audience, and to everyone who's watching today, please use the Q&A or use the chat and send through any questions you've got for these people who have firsthand knowledge of what's happening there, to hear about the specific trauma associated with women and girls as part of this situation is, I think, underscoring the importance of a comprehensive approach that Emergency Action Alliance can provide. By giving to the Emergency Action Alliance appeals when we're running them, it means that it goes to all of our members. Each one has a specialised focus area, and for ActionAid, this women-led approach is clearly absolutely crucial to the overall response. So thank you, Susan, for that. And I'd go now to Paul at Trócaire. Trócaire has been providing humanitarian assistance. Again, that's Caritas Australia's partner on the ground, providing humanitarian assistance in Somalia for over 30 years, I think. Can you please help us, Paul, to understand the reality on the ground there in Somalia and how this is affecting communities and families, and what's being done to help?
Thanks, Kerren. So Trócaire went in and it's the Irish Caritas, if you like. We went into Somalia in 1992 in response to a previous famine, and we've been there since. And I've been out this side for 25 years. Certainly in my experience, this is the longest and deepest drought that we've followed by flooding, sadly, and with all the consequences of that in terms of health and vector-borne diseases. We work through local elders, so everything is localized to make sure that the response is owned by the local community. And that gives us an ability to access particularly hard to reach areas. And in the context of where we work in Ghetto, Somalia, that's particularly important with the presence of armed militia. What I've seen, even 3 weeks ago when I was in one town called Luke, in a stabilization center. So we run and manage the health system in Ghetto, which has a population of about 1 million people, but it's about the size of Ireland. So it's kind of small in comparison to Australia, but for an Irish person, it seems like a reasonable size. But we manage the health system. We try to partner with the emerging Ministry of Health, but largely through district health boards. So all the malnutrition, the stabilization centers, and the nutrition is attached to resilience. Obviously, as Susan's mentioned, a key thing there in terms of protection, gender-based violence and women. We've been managing that, and we access about 300,000 people a year. What I've seen in the last few weeks and in the last year and a half, 2 years, is an ongoing crisis that is not going away. So yes, it has rained and the grass has come, but the cattle are dead. There are 4 million livestock gone. For a pastoralist community, that is an absolute nightmare. There's nothing left. There's no milk for children. So malnutrition continues to be a constant presence. And it's not just, malnutrition, it's severe malnutrition, severe acute malnutrition with complications. 3 weeks ago, a woman came into that loop carrying her baby. There was nothing left of the child. The child died within an hour and a half of being at the facility. And we're seeing that on a repeated basis, week by week by week by week. Children dying before we have a chance to help them to recover. Mothers, skin and bone, just about making it. Taking the long walk from rural areas in Ghetto or from Bai and Bakol, because there's nothing left. There are no livestock, there are no plants, there's nothing for them to survive on their little patches with their livestock gone. They take the walk to urban areas where they know the services of Trócaire have been in existence. But what we receive there are hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people, and I can't see how the world community is going to support them to go back to pastoralism, because it's that deep and it's that tragic. Girls particularly vulnerable, leaving schools, early marriage, all of those consequences. Vector-borne diseases, we had a very severe case of measles over the last number of months with children dying. So having to deal with all of that. We've had over the past month or two, terrible cholera cases and a spreading like wildfire through the various main towns in northern Ghetto, and having to set up cholera treatment centers and responses to that. Obviously, women and girls are more vulnerable. We run a school program trying to keep children in schools. It's mainly humanitarian education program, trying to ensure that if we can connect with the World Food Programme, keep children in school, that will guarantee them at least one meal a day and take the strain off the parents of the families and the internally displaced. We try to make sure that we access hard to reach communities, those on the margins, those who have stayed in small villages and rural areas, by having outreach teams. We wouldn't have been able to do this without support from the Australian people and the Australian government and the Emergency Action Alliance. Like has already been mentioned by Susan and Sophie, like water, irrigation, the grass, the malnutrition, the protection issues, everything is there, and all centered around potentially climate change and the impacts of climate change. And what that's going to look like for the future is quite frightening to me. As I said, I've been here a long time, but I've never seen it as bad as this. I think the kind of consequences have been explained, but on one person's life, a synergistic relationship between malnutrition, between health and water, those things merge into a catastrophic event. And yes, possibly we've been able to avert famine in Somalia so far. Having said that, I'd say over 50,000 people have died. But the worst effects, now the humanitarian response plan hasn't received yet 30% of funding. And so this is not going to go away. And then the global community seems to be forgetting that this crisis. It fascinates me that things go on in Europe, in Australia, in the rest of the world, and these communities continue to suffer catastrophic impacts of climate change. And we continue to live our lives as if it's not happening. In terms of the responses, I think that what I've seen in the most recent responses, the better responses are always more integrated between different organizations. They've integrated different components, particularly protection, SGBV, access to schools, making sure we try to keep children in schools, if the schools are still open, of course. If we can coordinate better, make sure that our responses are connecting with other organizations, and potentially trying to introduce some resilience component into your response. So, I mean, that can be very difficult to do when you're trying to save lives, but I still think it behoves us as a humanitarian community to look to see what the future can hold for such communities. So we do have resilient programs, agroecology, supporting families to get back on their feet. After the stabilization center, severe acute malnutrition. By the way, I know this, they say this crisis has been averted, but in our 30-year history, this last month of May, so we haven't got the figures for June yet, is the worst, the biggest number of cases of severe acute malnutrition we've ever had. So this hasn't gone away. We are our stabilization centers for severe acute malnutrition with complications are completely overrun. And that's just with complications. That's not mentioning severe acute malnutrition or moderate acute malnutrition, which we're also responding to with the support of the World Food Programme. So it's still catastrophic. It's still a nightmare scenario. The long walk continues for many women and families, bringing their children being buried on the side of the road before they get to urban centres, mothers arriving with children with nothing left, and then having to manage those families to try to help them recover over a short period of time and hopefully to get them back to some dignity and livelihood in the future. But we're a long way yet from resolving this. There are major questions for the international community about what to do in the context of climate change. Is pastoralism as a whole way of life in the southern parts of Somalia, in the northeastern parts of Kenya, in south central Somalia? Is it gone? Is it recoverable? We need a lot of imagination, a lot of thinking to do to really get to the bottom of this. We've been lucky in that we've been there a long time and we're able to engage with communities because of our legitimacy over that time and because of the fact that our elders give us the permission, the access, and it's their work primarily rather than us that keeps our program afloat. And we're able to normally on a normal day treat 19,000 people at our facilities every month. But there's so many questions to answer, so many questions to think through if we're going to resolve this in any dignified way for the future. At the heart of it, we've got to address climate change. We've got to put more imagination together, or else we're going to see the continuing destruction of communities, the displacement of communities. There's, like, just in the last year, 1.5 million new IDPs in Somalia, with like tens of thousands in my area alone, and that's only one district within Somalia. So huge thanks to the Australians, to the Emergency Action Alliance. What we've done with that, to be honest, we've plugged huge gaps in. There's been major issues around procuring plumpy nut and plumpy sup, huge issues around managing and trying to keep our stabilization centers open. So we've spent a huge amount of money on that when all the stocks had been bought up by the US system and there was nothing left. So we've been able to keep our stabilization centers going, keep our medical centers going, keep our outreach centers. And the key, an integrated community case management approach is merging hygiene, health, nutrition, protection right into the communities, going into communities with community health workers, female community influencers, training on hygiene practices, doing mid-upper arm circumference screening at a community level, taking a tuk-tuk or a car, whatever is available, going deep into the heart of communities and finding where are the problems so that the strain on the medical centers is reduced, and integrating your nutrition, your health, your hygiene, your protection into one program, and training people at community level to be able to do the basic stuff at community level, and then we're able to absorb the further shocks at the main static level facilities. It's a great program, but it's only there because of your support. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Paul. It's so difficult to hear these stories, but important for us to understand the reality of what's happening right now and the complexity of this catastrophe. It is hunger, but it's also disease, it's violence. There's so many other factors at play, making this an incredibly complex challenge to resolve. We do already have a question for you, Paul, specific to Somalia. So I might just ask that of you now before we go on to Trudi. The question is from Prafula, and it's, is the security situation affecting the program implementation, your program implementation? And is the government investigation also affecting your work?
Yes to both. I mean, obviously, we're in a territory which is largely dominated by the presence of Al-Shabaab. I haven't mentioned it because the other stuff is so severe, although Al-Shabaab have kept some communities from accessing services. So insecurity is a daily occurrence. There is a black line offensive from the federal government to try and root out of all of these areas. That hasn't taken place yet in Jubaland or in Ghetto. There's not only that insecurity with extremism, but you've also got inter-clan conflict with the emergence of new institutions, the Jubaland government, and them trying to impose their own officials in a place where a different clan has dominates the political and the population, the political scene as well as the population. So security is an issue, a daily issue. Accessing, getting trucks, getting food supplies, getting medical supplies, and all of that into communities. As I said before, critical for us over that 30 years is working through the elders, through local communities. You see very little of us. When you see it, you see local people, local communities responding, and then people at the local area, which kind of encases or protects us from the worst impacts. Now, that doesn't mean to say that on a daily basis I have to manage security incidents, and it is a reality. But yeah, and then government, the emerging government, and then bureaucracy, and then you've got corruption, you've got everything as part of a political economy, and that goes for Somalia, northeastern Kenya, south Ethiopia. Every car hire, every piece of food, every job, everything is part of a political economy. The sub-clans will fight for their people to get this, their people to that. Sometimes there will be inter-clan conflict and which will have severe impacts on our ability to reach particular sections. And I might mention marginalized clans and marginalized communities in particular. Trócaire has been the only one accessing them across the river with a raft. We built a raft about 20 years ago. It goes across on a daily basis, bring our supplies, our medicines there, and work with local elders in those marginalized communities. But security remains an issue. Marginalizations, the manipulation or the attempted manipulation of aid and of the structure of aid is a constant reality that you have to address.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Paul. We do have a number of other questions, but I think we'll just step across to Trudi. If you could, Trudi, as the CEO of Australia for UNHCR, you'd have a very clear picture of this crisis across the region from a regional perspective. Could you share with us what you know and how UNHCR is helping? And again, what help is needed? What's that gap at the moment?
Thanks, Kerren. I think, we're hearing really similar themes across from Paul, Sophie and Susan, and that those themes are being felt by the UN Refugee Agency as well in this situation. I guess when we're talking to my colleagues on the ground, UNHCR's had a long presence in the Horn of Africa, probably similar to going back to 1988, I think, in some situations. And the key approach for the UN Refugee Agency is around emergency support, but also looking at longer term solutions. And I saw that one of the questions was around longer term solutions. So I can sort of talk a little bit to that and what UNHCR is trying to do. But I thought if we're looking across Kenya, Ethiopia and Somalia, which are the sort of most impacted by this drought, but all the other factors, if I can give you some of the numbers from UNHCR. So, obviously the UNHCR is looking after refugees and displaced people. And since January last year, there's been 2 million people who have been internally displaced in Somalia and Kenya due to the drought, and a further 257,000 new refugees and asylum seekers going into drought-affected areas in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia. So going from drought-affected areas into drought-affected areas. And some of those are impacted by conflict as well. So there's huge movements of people. And that's on top of an existing 910,000 existing refugees and asylum seekers in drought-affected areas in Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia. And just on, you know, we've got a similar situation with being unfunded. UNHCR works with partners on the ground and is on the ground itself and works with the government. I guess one of the key things that UNHCR is responsible for is working with local authorities along international borders to facilitate refugee registration and documentation, so arrivals can have their special needs met and appropriate assistance. And again, child and gender-based violence protection measures can also be intensified there. But on top of that, UNHCR's got, you know, responsible for emergency shelter and household items for newly arrived refugees who are coming through and displaced people. We're working on increasing water supply to those in need, and that has included trucking water into displacement camps. And some of those common themes around just the cost of petrol, for instance, to get those trucks going have just gone up enormously. Cash assistance has been provided, and that's becoming more and more important for vulnerable populations. And also health facilities and getting, you know, plumpy nut or high nutrition to children and particularly women for medical treatment as well. So, and just a couple of things, I know we're running short of time, but a couple of things if we look at climate action and longer term solutions. UNHCR is working in Ethiopia, for instance, close to the Somali border, with the Ethiopian government planting 25 million trees there, just to help with the deforestation that's taken place in that space. And UNHCR is also spearheading work to get climate financing so that the people who are most in need can, you know, be helped. And then I think on sustainable water supplies, as you can hear from the other panelists, this is a huge issue, and it has, if you don't have water, you know, you're in a very dire situation, and that's what we're hearing right now. And UNHCR is working on, particularly in Melchizedek, piloting new technology to identify where water sources are so that we're better able to access water for these displaced populations and for refugees. So I'll finish there and hand back to you, Kerren. It's a very dire situation. There's great need for help, but I want people to know on this call that there are things that you can do to help. And yeah, please help.
Great, thank you so much, Trudi. And you have covered off one of the questions regarding climate change and some of the things that are being done there. We've got if there are any other comments from the panel on climate change and climate resilience and what's being done, that would be great if you can jump in. And we also have a question about the unique needs of people with disabilities, who are always the ones who are impacted the most by any disaster situation. How are they coping and what's being done specifically for people with disabilities?
Can I come in on that? So
You can.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is just about good programming. So if you're not addressing the needs of the more vulnerable groups in the population, then you're not doing good programming. And in humanitarian and development programming, you need to ensure that the least, the lost, the furthest behind have access to the resources. So that's just about, and it's not, there is no excuse for not doing good programming. I mean, we're not a bunch of amateurs at this stage. we've got to get our programming right and make sure that the most vulnerable in the community are targeted. So for me, it's very simple. We know who they are. As I mentioned, marginalized communities within my presentation, but you're right. Disability and other issues in the community need to be factored in when you're designing a program. Hopefully, you're doing that with communities so that the most vulnerable are targeted and identified.
Thanks, Paul. Any comments from Sophie?
Kerren, when I come in? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes, I'd like to maybe say something about the question about sustainability. What are we doing in that regard? But of course, at the moment, the situation is so dire that, you know, we are asking for cash assistance or food assistance, but that's only a band-aid. You know, we really need to look at what we can do so that this cycle, we break the cycle of, you know, repeated and recurrent crisis year after year after year. And what we're doing is the root cause in Ethiopia, of course, is conflict. So we need access. I mean, we need access to reach the communities and to support them where they are so that they don't have to migrate and, you know, leave their livelihoods, etc. But the other one is climate change, of course. Ethiopia is really, really vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And populations, I mean, Ethiopia is a rural country, you know, 80%, 70% now, because service is overtaking as the biggest sector in the economy. But 70 to 80% is agriculture, and most of the, you know, farming is done, is rain-fed, basically, and they depend on the rain. And as you can see with climate change, you can't depend on the rain. It's become very unpredictable. And if it comes, it's very intense at times. And it's farmers don't know when to plant. And so one of the things that we're doing, some of the questions that were coming on the chat is about what we're doing in terms of adaptation and mitigation. And one of our flagship programs for LWF in Ethiopia is soil and water conservation, through which we are building many irrigation systems. Very easy to maintain, like river diversions in the areas, because Ethiopia has a lot of perennial rivers, but they're not taken advantage of. And so what we're trying to do is to divert some of these rivers so that, and build some irrigation systems so that farmers do not have to depend on the rain, but these rivers are running throughout the year, so they can have 2 to 3 crops a year. But these are very expensive, of course. You know, these require quite a bit of capital investment, but we prioritize that as one of our adaptation priority programming in LWF. Where we don't have a lot of perennial rivers or where the water table is very, very low, like in Somalia region, what we try to do is to drill very deep boreholes and then, you know, have introduce drip or sprinkler irrigation, because these are really water-saving technologies and very well adapted to these regions. So that's what we're trying to do in terms of lift, you know, these populations and from these kinds of crises all the time. But of course, we are not reaching the numbers that we need to reach. But for example, for the river diversions, we built across the country, and we're continuing to build in some areas like Amhara and Tigray, along the Tigray and, you know, Amhara borders, etc. So this are something that we're doing. But in some areas, of course, like my colleague from Somalia, Paul, has said, access is very complicated. If you don't reach the people, if there is no peace, this is something that we really need to invest. And what we're trying to do is nexus programming, looking at humanitarian work, but also look at the whole nexus through development programming and peace building. Because without peace, without reconciliation between the communities, we can't do much. And this thing is continuing. So peace building has become one of the most important priority programming for us, which was not looking back 3-4 years ago. But now we have a nexus programming now going on in Tigray, between the Amhara and Tigray communities, but we need to do more with Somali and Oromo conflict, between the Oromo and the Southern peoples. So peace is one other aspect of sustainable work that we need to do together with climate change, peace, and development work. WASH also is hugely important. I mean, I thought I had 3 minutes, so I didn't really talk about all what we do in terms of protection, in terms of WASH, but WASH is a big, big sector for us in LWF. We do construct a lot of water systems in, irrigation, in refugee, but also IDP context, and Ethiopians at risk in the host communities. We build that, and particularly now, just like in Somalia, we have huge cholera outbreaks in Somali region, in Oromia region particularly. We have measles also, scabies, you name it. And so WASH is actually very, very important to provide potable water, sanitation, and also hygiene and sanitation promotion. I mean, this is really part of our core programming, what we do in all contexts, IDP, refugee, and host community context. So that's what I wanted to see. And in terms of targeting, of course, this is very, very important, and we can't reach everybody. So what we prioritize, we have selection criteria based on vulnerability, and who we target are basically pregnant women, lactating women, elderly people, people with chronic diseases, and people with disability. These are the people, our main targets for our support, because basically we cannot reach 20-something million people. So out of our targeting, our target criteria, disability is absolutely crucial. It's part of our standard selection criteria. Thank you. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie.
I'd like to say something very quickly about the climate change thing, because there are local solutions and there are macro solutions. So at a government level, there needs to be a concerted effort to address irrigation, but on a much bigger scale than any NGO or even UN system could imagine. So they need global funding to address, and they should have that money, and we should be paying them back for the damage that they've done, that has been done to their communities. So macro solutions in terms of addressing water, but local solutions such as agroecology and permaculture. So when women come out of our stabilization centers with their children, we enter them into a program to learn, if they're pastoralist people, to learn skills in agroecology, to make sure they handle the soil properly, to be able to irrigate, but to mix crop as well. So 20 million trees, as Sophie says, is a great idea, but intercrop as well, change the microclimate. And each family has an opportunity of changing the microclimate within their particular context. So there are micro solutions as well as macro solutions to the climate issue. Thank you.
Yes, it feels as though we might need to have another session in a couple of months' time to get an update on how things are going, because there's so much more to be explained to help with the understanding of the crisis. There's urgency. I'm hearing an urgent need, and I'm hearing long-term solutions as well. And money is the thing that's standing between those solutions and where we are now. So because of time, we need to wrap up. I just wanted to say thank you so much to this panel who have given up their time at a very busy time for them, doing important work to help us understand what's going on. And a big thank you also to Aidan for the opportunity to provide these insights into this unimaginable situation. Look, it is the second last day of the financial year, and our members are all running urgent appeals linking into this crisis. So what we have on the Emergency Action Alliance website, if you go to the appeals tab and click on hunger crisis, you'll see all of the links to our members who are running appeals for the hunger crisis. So you've heard from just 3 of our members, all 15 of our members are running appeals. This is how critical this crisis is. Please, if you can, go to that page and give what you can. So thank you once again to Aidan and to all of our amazing panelists. I'm just going to put up a final share screen, which has Emergency Action Alliance members and our website location. So if that's okay, I'll just share that now, and thank you all for your participation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.